Today, I want to go over this post, which is updates to Cavalier difficulty support buffs. This is a pretty decent buff to the Cavalier difficulty support buffs. That said, as always, there's a link to the forum in the description below. But otherwise, I'll dive right in. So from Kabam John, he says, "Hey all, over the past few months we've been monitoring Cavalier closely and we've come to the conclusion that the current tuning of support buffs hasn't enabled players to get through the content as fast as we had hoped. Our goal is that there is a fairly large increase in damage output for champions that interact with the global support buffs well. Currently, the amount of time it takes to get to the max bonus for each support buff is too long, so we're going to lower the total but increase each stack's potency. This should help with summoners getting to those huge damage numbers at a much faster rate and finish those path fights much quicker. We're going to continue monitoring Cav going into the future and would love to hear more from all of you. Here is the list of changes we'll be making for the December update." So before I go into the numbers, because they literally just half the numbers across the board, as well as raise the value of the Fury potency or the prowess potencies, etc., etc., the first thing I want to say is that I love this buff. It's a really, really good buff, and for some of these, it's going to be amazing, particularly for the Scientific Exploit, for the Punishment Glutton, maybe for Mystic, depending on who you're using. These are going to be really, really amazing. For Seeing Red, Cosmic Grit, and Power Technician, it's a little dependent on your roster, but the other three, I felt like those are very, very commonly accessed. And so it's a little bit half and half. I think for me, the bigger issue I had with the buffs wasn't that they weren't making me feel powerful when I was taking advantage of them. It was that, the roster with which you needed to utilize in order to access these buffs was fairly limited. And then on top of that, you go into a path and there are numerous fights where you just bring other champions that aren't accessing these buffs because the paths have particular hiccups along the way where you just can't access the buffs. It's just not realistic. And so for me, that's the bigger issue. Now, of course, the mini bosses and stuff, the things without these buff nodes on them, etc., totally understand, bring a counter for, super reasonable. But there were a number of fights where it was just no, you just need to bring something different and just completely ignore the class advantage. And in those situations, it doesn't matter how much you tune up this buff or this node if we're not utilizing it in the first place. So I wanted to mention that because I do think that's really important. But that said, this is a massive change, and I'm really, really looking forward to seeing how it impacts my Cavalier run this month. And hopefully I have good things to say about it at the end as well. So what they're doing for Scientific Exploit is they're changing it from 15% Fury, max stacks 20, to 35% Fury, max stacks 10. Super awesome. I love that. I think for Scientific Exploit, this is one of the most frequently utilized Furies after the most recent change as well, because now any debuff, including stun, triggers this, so it's super, super accessible, and at 10 stacks, honestly, 10 parries is not a lot, so pretty much any Science champion can access this, and then you really only got to worry about the dish track, which is being paired up with this, so that minimizes the roster, but at least you don't, have crazy minimization there. But additionally, I think that this one, out of all of them, given the fact that it was paired with dish track, I think that max 20 stacks wasn't too crazy, inhibitive here. So this is probably going to be one of the lesser felt changes, but it is going to be still very, very nice. Even if on average it changes the number of hits you do in this path from 45 to 28 or 30, which I do think will have diminishing returns on the quantity of hits it changes or affects you when you bring in. Still going to be a solid change. Should save you hopefully a half hour just on that path or that quest. For Power Technician, same concept. They've changed it from max stacks 20 to max stacks 10. They've also increased the Fury potency to 35%. They've also increased the power drain to 15%. This is a really, really good change because previously the power drain was enough to mitigate, but just not quite enough. So hopefully this little bit of extra 15% total power drain is enough to really push it over the edge. I wish it was a 5% or 10% flat power instead. So it wasn't reliant on total power, but it's still a good buff to see. I don't know how impactful it will be, but we'll have to see. Otherwise, I would say this is overall a solid roster change as well. Although for tech, I do feel a lot of champions don't necessarily take advantage of this, especially with Ghost in the meta, but Ghost is fast enough that she doesn't really need access to the buff. So pretty good argument there as well. I think out of all of the changes, this might be one of the lesser felt ones, depending on where your roster is, but it's still a nice change. Punishment Glutton, they're changing the theory from 15 to 35, also halving the stacks. This one is also super easily accessible. I absolutely love it. When I had Black Widow Deadly Origins ramped up all the way, she felt super powerful. This is definitely going to save me like 10 to 12 hits. And 10 to 12 hits, you know, over the course of 60 fights, it's actually really impactful. So I like seeing that one. For the Mystic consumption, they're doubling the prowess, halving the stacks. This one is interesting. Because it's a prowess buff, I don't feel like it's going to be as impactful as the Furies. Like, the Furies hit and they make a big difference right out the gate. The prowesses are reliant on your specials, and a lot of Mystic champions, they nullify, you know, through staggers, so it's not too quick. This one is one I'm going to have to keep an eye on, just because of the way and the nature that Mystics utilize this buff and the way it works with the prowesses and the extra damage scaling. I'll have to see. I'm interested. I think it's got good potential, but I do think out of all of them, I think they just went for flat changes across the board, but I wouldn't mind if they jump back in and tune Mystic consumption a little bit. But I will kind of put a caveat there that champions like Black Widow Clairvoyant with their prowess just have insane amounts of sustain, insane amounts of lifesteal, and she works for so many fights and so many champions, and honestly just like the crazy amount of sustain off the prowess is insane. And so with that, you know, it's tough to say they really need to do much more of a change. Like, even a 4-star Black Widow Clairvoyant does crazy things with Mystic consumption, so to a degree, keeping it tuned, you know, around that in mind is very relevant, kind of like what we see with Cosmic Grit and Angela. So yeah, I will have to keep an eye on that for non-Black Widow Clairvoyant relevance, but we'll see. Should be good at least, you know, for a quick little boost there. For Seeing Red, this one I think is one of the least utilized nodes, but maybe that's just for me because I utilize Omega Red. But same thing here, double the prowess percentage, half the stacks, same value. Should be interesting. Again, prowess not as immediately effective as Fury, so this, you know, double the potency, half the stacks doesn't have the same immediate raw value change as the Furies do. Additionally, you know, not all mutant champions are like super special reliant. Same with Mystic, not all Mystic champions are super special reliant for their damage output, and so they don't benefit nearly as much from these. But again, I think that these two nodes are super friendly as far as how you can handle them and how you deal with them, so that comes with that major benefit as well. So a little bit of mixing of balance there. And then finally, Cosmic Grit, same thing, aptitude double, max stacks half. And I think this is going to be really good because Cosmic is all about maximizing those buffs. I wouldn't mind aptitude being closer to like 60 or 70% actually, and then even less stacks, just because it just takes so long to build them up. Unlike the diss track Cosmic one, ramping up these aptitudes can be a major pain in the arse. Yes, it's still fast, but it's definitely something you have to actively do instead of just kind of passively doing it. So this one I think could be a little bit faster, but overall, amazing changes here. I really want to hype them. I'm interested to see how big of an impact it has, because yes, you can double the values, but that doesn't necessarily mean half the time. Actually, it almost certainly does not mean half the time. You do see degraded returns, but it would be cool if this Cavalier monthly takes, you know, 6 or 7 hours instead. Definitely makes me reevaluate where I value the rewards. As always though, let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.